She said it like she was already done deciding, like the question had been answered before he ever opened his mouth. And if you think you know what kind of story that is, stay with this one, because you don't, not yet. You think it's about a woman who needed help and took what she could get. You think it's about a man without options who lucked into something warmer than a bunkhouse. But what it's actually about is two people who had already lost the most important thing they'd ever had, and who found out, slowly and against their will, that the world had left them one more thing to find. That's what this is. So stay. Because the moment she said those words, she said them on a Wednesday morning in late October, with frost still on the fence rails and her hands already dirty from work she'd started before dawn. That moment was the hinge the rest of her life turned on, and she nearly missed it. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Her name was Clara Voss. She had come to the Sweetgrass Valley 4 years before the morning in question. Not by choice in the way most people mean the word, but by the kind of choice that is really just a refusal to fall apart in any place that had witnesses. She had been a school teacher in a river town 200 miles east, and she had married a man named Edmund Voss when she was 22 and he was 29, and for 6 years that marriage had been the steady center. Edmund was not a dramatic man. He did not make speeches or promises he couldn't measure. He was the kind of man who came home at the same time every evening, and who could fix most things with his hands, and who sat with Clara on the porch in the summer dark without needing to fill every silence. She had loved him in the way you love something you cannot imagine the absence of, which is to say, she had never truly prepared for it. He was gone in 11 days. A fever that came in August, which everyone agreed was too late in the year for that kind of fever, and which took him from a healthy man to a buried one in a span of time so short that Clara had not yet learned how to be a widow by the time she was already one. She was 28, they had no children. She had a small savings account at the town bank, her own 2 hands, and a mind that had been educated past what the river town was willing to pay her to use. She taught school for 1 more year after Edmund died, and then she stopped because she could not stand the way the other teachers looked at her, with that careful and exhausting sympathy that required her to perform either grief or recovery. She came to Sweetgrass Valley because a woman she had known briefly, a neighbor named Ruth Packard, had written to say that Ruth's father was willing to sell his 40-acre parcel cheaply to someone steady and serious. Clara bought the land. She did not tell anyone in the river town she was leaving until the day she left. She loaded what fit in a wagon, and she drove it herself. And she arrived at the 40 acres on a morning in late March, when the ground was still hard and the farmhouse needed a new roof on the east side. She looked at all of it and felt something she would later identify as relief. There was too much work to do here for grief to have any room to spread. That had been 4 years ago. She had put on the roof herself, hiring 2 men from the valley for 2 weeks. And she had cleared the well herself, and she had planted the first summer's garden, and kept 3 goats, and cured the hides. Had not failed completely either. She kept accounts in a ledger with the same precision she had once used for lesson plans. She knew to the dollar what she owed, and to the dollar what she had, and she had kept the 2 columns in the right order, barely, but consistently, for 4 years. She had made a few friends in the small way that a solitary person makes friends: the postmistress, a family named Dorr, 3 miles down the valley road, who had a daughter of 9 who liked to come and hear Clara, and an old man named August Schiller who ran the feed and dry goods store in the valley's one town, and who had been Edmund's godfather's second cousin, a connection so thin it was almost a joke. But August had felt the connection was enough to call on Clara twice a year with a small gift of cured sausage. She called that enough. She had told herself, and she almost believed it, that she had simplified her life, that what she'd done was remove the complexity and the noise. She worked from first light until the light gave out, and she ate her supper alone, and she read for an hour, and she slept, and she woke, and she did it again. It did not belong in the account book she kept of her life. It was a thing that couldn't be measured, and so she did not enter it. Then came the October that changed the measure of everything. He appeared at the gate on the 22nd of October at 5:40 in the morning, which Clara knew because she had already been awake for 40 minutes and had wound and checked the mantel clock out of habit before going to the barn. She was crossing back from the barn with a bucket when she saw the shape of a man at the far end of the fence line, standing with the particular stillness of someone who is cold and exhausted and trying to decide something. She set the bucket down. She picked up the splitting maul that was propped against the barn door, not because she intended to use it, but because her hands needed something to hold. She walked to within 20 feet of the gate and stopped. He was perhaps 35, though the road and the cold had put years on him that may not have been truly his. He was dark-eyed and lean in the way of someone who has missed meals and not complained about it. He held his hat in both hands in front of him, which struck her as an odd formality for a stranger at a gate before sunrise, and he had a canvas pack on one shoulder that looked nearly empty. He had a letter in his hand. He held it out before she could speak, as though the letter were an explanation that would save them both the trouble of the usual preamble. He said his name was Thomas Reyes. He said that he believed she might have known August Schiller. She said she knew August. He said that August had told him, if the worst came, and he had nowhere left to go, to walk to the Voss place, on the Sweetgrass Valley Road. He said August had died 3 weeks ago, in a town 40 miles south, where Thomas had been working a harvest crew, and that August had been sick for some time, and had known it. He said he was sorry to bring bad news. He said it like someone who had delivered bad news before and had learned that brevity was kinder than elaboration. Then he stood and waited. Clara felt August's absence land in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She had not known he was ill. She had not known, and the not knowing made it worse, because she understood that August had decided to spare her and had done so with the same efficient care he applied to everything. She breathed through it and held out her hand for the letter. It was 3 pages in August's small, close hand, and it was written to her, not about her. He had addressed her by name at the top, and then had spoken to her as plainly as he always spoke, which was the way of a man who had lived long enough to dislike wasted words. He wrote that Thomas Reyes had worked for him off and on for 9 years. He wrote that in 9 years he had never once found Tomas to be dishonest or careless or cruel, which August noted were the 3 things he could not forgive in a man, and that he had found him instead to be skilled with animals and machinery and with the kind of... He wrote that Thomas had suffered his own losses and had not let those losses make him bitter, which August considered the hardest and most important thing a person could do with suffering. He wrote that he was sending Thomas to her not as a charity case for her to manage, but as a worker of demonstrated quality, who needed steady ground under him, and who was too proud to accept anything that smelled like pity. He wrote that if she had work to offer, she should offer it as work and pay him as a worker, and that would be sufficient and honorable for both of them. He wrote that he trusted her judgment and that he expected it. And then, at the very bottom of the last page, in a line that seemed to have been added after the rest was already finished, he had written, "There is a second reason I am sending him to you, Clara, but I will let you and time work that out together because you're both at bottom sensible people. And I am already more involved in other people's business than I have a right to be." She read those 3 pages standing at the gate in the pre-dawn cold with the splitting maul in one hand and the letter in the other. She folded them and put them in her coat pocket. She looked at Thomas Reyes, who had stood very still and very straight through the whole of it, and who had not tried to read her face or press her for a response. She could see in the growing gray light that he had walked a long way to get here. She could see that he was holding himself erect by an act of will that had perhaps another hour in it at most. She thought of August. She thought of Edmund. She thought of the east field that needed to be turned before the ground froze hard, and the roof on the chicken coop that had begun to bow under the weight of 2 seasons, and the goat she suspected had developed foot rot, and the ledger that had looked, last month, slightly more precarious than she liked. She thought of all of that, and then she looked at him again, and she said, "All right, come inside, there's coffee." He worked. That was the first and most important thing about those early weeks. He worked the way serious people work, without theater and without the need to be observed doing it. On the first full day, she showed him the east field and the coop roof and the sick goat and the tool shed where the implements lived. And she told him what she expected in terms of the sequence of priorities and the way she kept accounts, and the fact that she tracked every hour, tracked both. He nodded. He did not say the accounting seemed like more than most hands did. He said he would keep track. She showed him the bunk room off the back of the barn that had been empty for 2 years, and that she had swept out and put a fresh mattress in that morning while he had been at the well with the goat. He looked at the room for a moment and then looked at her and said, "This is more than I expected." She said it was work and not generosity, and that he should not confuse the two. He said he didn't intend to. In the first week, he turned the east field. He did this in 4 days instead of the 6 she had budgeted for, and he did it without being asked to work at any particular pace. She watched him from a distance on the second afternoon and understood that his method was slightly different from hers. He worked the draft horse in longer passes, resting the animal more deliberately at the turns. She did not say anything about it, but the following week, when she worked the field beside the kitchen garden herself, she used the longer passes. He fixed the goat. He knew about foot rot, had apparently dealt with it before on several occasions, and he treated the animal with a solution of copper sulfate he made from materials in the shed, and by the end of the 2nd week, the goat was walking without favoring the leg. She thanked him. He said the goat had good constitution and had done most of the work herself. He did not talk much. During the days, he talked a little in the evenings, which surprised her. She had made supper the first evening and had not been sure whether to set a second place at her kitchen table or to send food out to the bunk room, and she had stood with the second plate in her hand for a long moment before setting it across from her own, because she thought August would have considered the alternative unkind and petty. Tomas had come in from the barn, had washed his hands at the outside basin, had come to the table, and waited for her to sit first. They had eaten the first supper mostly in silence, which was not awkward so much as careful, the way the silence of two people in a small space is careful when neither knows the other's geography yet. But on the second evening he had asked her how long she had kept goats, and she had told him, and that had opened enough space for him to mention that he had grown up in a family that kept a large herd of dairy goats in a valley much further south, that his mother had known things about goats that no book she'd ever read had contained, and that the foot rot treatment was one of the things she'd taught him before he was 10 years old. Clara had asked about his mother. He had said she had been a particular kind of person, which he meant as the highest compliment. He did not elaborate, and she did not press, and they had finished supper, and she had washed the dishes, and he had dried them without being asked to, and then he had gone back to the bunk room, and she had sat in the lamplight with August's letter again. Something else, because she was not ready for the something else to be that yet. The coop roof took most of the third week. It was harder work than the field, requiring the kind of repetitive overhead labor that wears a person down differently, and by the fourth day of it, both of them were tired in a particular bone way, and she brought coffee out to the coop at midday without planning to. He took it. He looked at the valley below the property, which you could see from that height the long gold slope of it in the late October light. And he said, "This is a good place." She said she thought so too. He said August described it, but he was better with people than landscapes. She smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in some while. She realized, or the first time she'd noticed it, which might not have been the same thing. She looked away before he could see her noticing it, and she went back to the house. And that evening she told herself that she was glad to have competent help, and that was a reasonable and sufficient thing to be glad about. By the end of the fourth week, something had shifted in the texture of the silence between them. It was harder to name than to feel. In the first week, the silences had been careful and bounded, the silences of two cautious strangers sharing space. By the fourth week, they had become something more like the silences of people who had agreed without speaking it, that not everything needed to be spoken. He began to leave small things in ways that told her he had noticed her routine. The coffee pot set on the back of the stove so it stayed warm while she was in the barn. The kindling box refilled before she thought to ask. The latch on the garden gate that had stuck for 2 years fixed one afternoon while she had been in town. Repaired so quietly, she had to look twice to confirm the fix was real. She began to leave things, too, without framing them as gestures. The lamp burning a little longer in the evening so the path from barn to bunk room was lit, the extra portion of supper that was never commented upon but was always there. A copy. Lost on the corner of the table, without explanation. He told her one evening near the end of the month that his wife had died 2 years ago. He said it, the way you say something that has been sitting near the surface for some time and has finally found a moment it could bear. His wife had been a woman named Feliciana, and she had died in childbirth along with the child, and he had spent the following year in a state that he described as simply working and not thinking, which Clara recognized with a recognition that lived below words.
She said,
Yes. He looked at her. She said, Edmund was 11 days. He said nothing for a moment, and then he said, I'm sorry. And then they sat with that between them for a while, and the silence was of a different quality than any silence that had come before it, which was the quality of two people who have recognized the shape of each other's loss and found it. It was the town postmistress, a woman named Hazel Gruber, who missed very little and apologized for less, who brought the news in the first week of November. She had driven out on a Saturday morning, which was unusual enough that Clara came to the door with a serious face before Hazel had climbed down from the wagon. Hazel said that a man named Corbin Vale had come into town 3 days ago and had been asking questions. Not the kind of asking that was simple curiosity, the kind that was assembling information, room by room, the way you walk through a house you intend to take. He had been asking about the Boss property, about its size and its water rights and its access road, and whether the widow had any family in the territory. He had asked about the solvency of the operation, and Hazel said she had told him nothing useful, but that the man at the land office had been less discreet, and that Vale's questions had had the shape of a pretext that was already being built. Hazel said, I don't know what he's reaching for, but he has the look of a man who reaches first and worries about right and wrong after. Clara thanked her and stood in the doorway for a moment after Hazel drove away, looking at the fence line and the east field and the coop roof with its new shingles and the well and the 40 acres of ground she had poured 4 years of her life into. She went inside. She told Tomas that evening what Hazel had said. He listened with his hands still on the table and his face unchanged. He said, Do you know the name? She said she did not. He said, Is there anyone who might carry a claim against a land? She said there was not. The land had been bought clear. She had paid cash money and had a deed registered at the county office with no encumbrances. He said, Then we should get the paperwork in order, in case someone tries to make it complicated. She looked at him across the table and noted, not for the first time, how he had used the word we. Corbin Vale came on a morning 11 days after Hazel's warning, which Clara would later count as the particular cruelty of that number. He was a large man in good clothes, the kind of good that was meant to signal money, and managed instead to signal the desire to signal money, and he had 2 men with him who stood at the gate like punctuation. He introduced himself with the ease of someone who expected his name to be recognized. He said that he had an interest in land in the Sweetgrass Valley as part of a development enterprise, that he was aware the Voss property had been operating at what he called reduced capacity, and that he had spoken with a land agent in the county seat who had suggested, he used it carefully, that there might be a question regarding the water rights on the north boundary of the 40 acres, a question that might, in his words, complicate the standing of the deed if examined closely. Clara stood on the porch with her arms at her sides. She knew the water rights were clear. She had checked them, specifically and precisely, before she bought the land and had them confirmed in writing by 2 separate surveyors. She knew Corbin Vale knew they were clear. She also knew that the kind of question he was describing did not need to be true, to be expensive to disprove. and that expense was often the point. She said the water rights are registered and confirmed. He said, of course, but these things sometimes require revisiting, especially as land values shift. He said it with the warmth of a man explaining something for your own benefit. He said, I would be prepared to make a generous offer that would allow you to relocate without the trouble of any proceedings, and that I was sure a woman in her position would find the prospect of simplification attractive. There was a silence. Tomas came around the corner of the house from the back, the way a man comes, who has been somewhere nearby for a while and has timed his arrival with some care. He was carrying a fence post over one shoulder, and he set it against the porch rail with a deliberateness that was not casual. He looked at Vale. Vale looked at him. Vale's 2 men at the gate adjusted their postures slightly, the way men do when the arithmetic of a situation changes. Tomas said nothing. He simply stood there, and the standing there was a sentence by itself. Clara looked at Vale and said, the property is not for sale, and the water rights are not in question. If you believe you have a legitimate legal claim, I suggest you file it through the county court and allow it to be reviewed there, where there are records. She said, I have been maintaining this property for 4 years, with full documentation, and I am not interested in simplification. She said the word back to him, the way you return a gift you did not ask for. He looked at her and then looked at Tomas, and something in his calculation shifted. Not much, but enough. He said he would certainly consider his options, and that he hoped she would do the same. Clara looked at Tomas. He looked at the fence post. She said, thank you. He said, I was just moving materials. She said, yes, you were. And then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and breathed for a while, and she took out the ledger, and she took out August's letter, and she sat with both of them. She read the last line of the letter again. There is a second reason. She had known for some time now what it was. She had known it the way you know, something you have decided not to know, which is more completely than you know most things you have simply decided to know. She folded the letter. She looked out the window at the bare field and the coop and the mountains beyond the valley turning blue in the afternoon light, and she thought, a thing freely chosen is not the same as a thing accepted under pressure, and it is not the same as a debt being discharged. And if she was going to do this, she was going to do it correctly, which meant she was going to do it as a choice and not as anything else. She waited, not because she was uncertain, because she wanted the waiting itself to be evidence of the certainty. She did it on a Thursday evening 2 weeks later. November had come in fully by then, and the stove was working hard, and supper was done, and he had dried the dishes and was putting on his coat to go to the bunk room. She said, Waity waited. She said, I need to tell you something that I have been thinking about carefully. He sat back down. She stood on the other side of the table, which she told herself afterward was because she stood when she meant something seriously, not because the table felt like useful distance. She said, I am not in a position to take on a permanent hand, and I think you probably knew that when August sent you. She said, I think August knew it too, and I think that is why he wrote what he wrote at the end of his letter. She said, I am not offering you charity, and I am not asking you to stay out of any kind of fear about Vale, or about the winter, or about any circumstance that has to do with difficulty. She said, I am asking because I would like to, and because I think you are someone I would like my life to have in it. And because August told me there was a second reason, and I believe he was right, and I think you already know what it is. I would like for you to stay, not as a hand. I would like for you to stay as my husband, if that is something you could want. He looked at her for a long time. Not the way a person looks when they are deciding. The way a person looks when they are making sure the thing they already know is real. He said, I thought about August's second reason for a long time on the walk here. He said, I decided I would not assume. He said, I am glad you said it.
He said,
Yes? She nodded. He nodded. They stood there across the table from each other in the lamplight in the kitchen in November. And it was quiet, and it was enough, and it was the beginning of a thing that would need a great deal of work and time and patience. She wrote to the county seat the next morning for information about what was required. She drove to town and spoke to a man named Walter Freed, who was the territory's notary, and who had done the original deed registration, and who possessed the kind of careful legal knowledge that makes paperwork a form of defense. She explained what she was doing and what she needed, and then she explained about Corbin Vale and the fabricated water rights question, and asked Walter what the clearest way was to make the property's legal standing so thoroughly documented that the cost of challenging it would exceed any possible gain from the challenge. Walter sat with that for a moment and said, You want to make it not worth his while? She said, Yes. He said, I can do that. He also offered, somewhat gently, that a marriage registration at the county seat, combined with a formal joint deed filing, would create a legal enclosure around the property that would require Vale to challenge not one holding but two persons standing, which was considerably more expensive. He said, I mention it only because it's relevant to the legal picture. She said, I understand. I'll let you know when. She drove home. She and Tomas talked that evening, in the longest conversation they had yet had, about what the legal requirements were, and what the practical steps were, and what each of them understood themselves to be doing, and why. And it went on for 2 hours, with the lamp burning low and the fire working in the stove, and outside the wind off the mountains, beginning to carry sleet against the windows. She asked him at one point whether he wanted to keep the name Reyes, or whether he had any feeling about the question of names. He said he was keeping Reyes. He said he had had it from his father, and his father had it from his father, and that was not a thing he was leaving anywhere. She said good. She said her intention was to keep Voss, which had been Edmund's name, and was also now hers, and that she had no thought of changing it. He said, We'll be Voss and Reyes then. She said. They drove to the county seat on the 4th of December, which was a clear, cold day with new snow on the upper ridges and the valley road firmer than it had been all month. Walter Freed had prepared the paperwork and had arranged for the county clerk to serve as witness, a woman named Mrs. Alderman, who was small and efficient and who looked at them both over her spectacles with the expression of someone who has seen a great many people marry and can generally tell which ones mean it. She stamped and signed in the right places. Walter stamped and signed in his places. Clara and Tomas signed in their places. Walter shook Tomas's hand and shook Clara's hand, and said the water rights are now on record as incontestable. By the way, I included a full survey annotation in the joint deed. And any challenge to this property will now have to go through both of your standing and the county record and my office. Clara said, "Thank you, Walter." He said, "August was a good man." She said, "Yes, he was." They drove home in the early afternoon. He drove, and she sat beside him, and the valley spread out below them as they came over the small rise above the farm, the 40 acres, and the house and the barn and the coop, with its new roof and the east field resting under a thin shell of frost. The mountains behind it were white from midway up. The sky was the particular pale blue of a cold December day that has decided to be beautiful despite itself. She looked at it. She thought, 4 years ago, I came to this place with nothing but a wagon and a refusal to fall apart in public. And now there is someone sitting beside me who drove a long way on the word of a dead man. And I chose this, not because I had to, because I wanted to. Because August was right, and some things that go together simply belong together. And the belonging is not something that happens to you like weather. It is something you walk toward on your own 2 feet. He came with 3 men instead of 2 this time, and he had a letter from a land agent that purported to question the survey boundaries of the original deed. He came to the gate, and Clara walked to the gate. She handed him a document before he had finished his opening sentence. It was the joint deed registration with the county annotation attached and Walter Freed's office seal on every page. She said the survey is annotated and registered and the deed is jointly held, and the water rights are confirmed in triplicate. She said, "If you have a legal claim, please file it with the county court where it will be evaluated by a judge who has access to all of this." She said it without heat. She said it the way you tell someone, the weather not cruelly, but with the assurance of someone who has looked at the sky and knows what is coming. Vale looked at the document. He looked at Tomas. He looked at the gate, which was closed, and at the fence line, which was solid, and at the house behind them, which had smoke coming from the chimney and light in the windows. And he looked at the 2 people standing together at the gate, neither of them moving and neither of them afraid. And whatever arithmetic he ran came out differently than the arithmetic he had run in October. He said nothing more. He folded his copy of his letter very carefully and put it back in his coat. He did not come back. March came and the ground softened and the light lengthened, and Clara turned 42 acres instead of 40. Because Thomas had proposed in January with the same brevity he applied to most things, that they could put in a fence line along the south edge of the property and take in the 2 unused acres of the neighboring parcel, whose owner had died leaving no heirs, and that Clara should ask Walter whether a formal claim of use and maintenance might eventually yield clear title, which it could, and which it did, by the following autumn. They planted the east field together. She showed him the way she read the soil, which was something she had taught herself by trial and error over 4 seasons. And he showed her the way his mother had taught him to listen to what the plant wanted before deciding what to give it, which was a practice that sounded imprecise. It was a different kind of precision. They argued once in May about the placement of a new drainage channel, and the argument lasted 2 days, and concluded with him conceding that she had been right about the angle, and her conceding that he had been right about the depth, and afterward the silence between them was the best kind of silence, which is the silence of two people who have weathered a small thing and found that the ground held. The 9-year-old girl, the Dorr daughter, whose name was Marta, continued to come on Sunday afternoons. She became, over the course of that first shared year, somewhat fonder of Tomas than she had been of Clara, which Clara accepted with a dry amusement that she did not entirely hide from him. He had a way with Marta's particular brand of obstinate curiosity that was itself patient and curious and met her where she stood rather than where an adult thought she should stand. He taught her 2 words in Spanish each Sunday by her request, and she taught him 2 words of the Norwegian her grandmother had left in the family by his, and by summer she was keeping a notebook of both, which Clara noted in her own account of the year as evidence of something she could not quite categorize but which seemed important. She thought of Edmund. She did not stop thinking of him, and she did not try to. He was present in the way that the people we have truly loved are always present, not as absence, but as a kind of ongoing fact, like the light leaving the rock at the end of a summer evening. She thought Edmund would have liked Thomas, and she thought Edmund would have liked August's letter, and she thought Edmund would have understood that what she had built was not a replacement for what she had lost, but was a second thing, as real and as hers as the first, which was possible because nothing had been erased and nothing had been required to be. She mentioned Edmund sometimes in the evenings, and Tomas mentioned Feliciana, and both of them listened to the other without needing to offer comfort or resolution, because the comfort was in the listening. She put August's letter in the deed box with the land records. It seemed right for it to live there, with the other documents that had made the shape of her life legible. She had read it so many times she could have spoken it from memory, but she kept the paper because the paper had his handwriting, and his handwriting was the last version of his voice she had access to. And it had been a good voice, careful and plain and accurate, and she was not willing to rely entirely on memory when she had the real thing. August had written, "I trust her judgment, and I expect it." She liked that. She had always liked it. It was the best kind of compliment, the kind that doubles as an instruction. Some things that go together simply belong together, not because they are the same, but because they are fitted to each other in a way that only becomes clear through the work of being together. The field fitted to the rain, the roof fitted to the winter. The silence between two people fitted to the weight of what has been said and not needed saying. Clara had come to the Sweetgrass Valley with nothing. She hadn't carried herself and had built something that, on a cold October morning 4 years in, was sufficient and solitary. And then a man had stood at her gate with his hat in both hands and a letter from a dead man she loved, and she had said, "All right." And then she had said, "I am not asking you to stay as a hand." She had said it on a Thursday evening in November, in the lamplight with the sleet against the windows. She had said it as a choice, freely made, with nothing pressing her toward it but the clear-eyed evidence of weeks, and the accumulated honesty of a man who had, without announcing it, shown her, and she had been right to say it. A thing freely chosen is a thing that belongs to you, and you to it, in a way that obligation never quite manages. August had known that. Edmund would have known it. Thomas knew it. The valley knew it too, in the way that places know what is built in them, not in a way that speaks, but in a way that holds. The 42 acres held through the winter and through the spring and through the dry summer that came 2 years later, and tested everything they had built. And through all of it, there were 2 pairs of hands in the soil, and 2 voices in the kitchen, and 2 sets of accounts in the ledger, which balanced with a regularity that was not luck, but was the daily result of 2 people who had each already proven alone that they could survive, and who were finding out together that survival was not actually the highest thing you could aim for, that there was something above it, something that required more than one person to hold, something that looked on a May morning with the new growth coming in and the mountains still white and Marta Dor running down the valley road to see what Thomas would teach her this week. She had narrowed her life down to the ledger and the work and the clean solitude of a person who has decided that what remains after loss is enough to be going on with. She had been almost right. But the thing she had not yet known how to want was the thing that arrived at the gate on a cold October morning with a hat in its hands and a letter from August Schiller, and the patience to wait to be asked. Some things belong together, and the belonging, when you finally set down what you have been carrying in both hands and reach toward it, turns out to be the most ordinary thing in the world, and the most extraordinary, and the truest. And all of it had started with a Wednesday morning, and frost on the fence rails, and a woman who said what she meant in the fewest possible words, and a man who had walked a long way on the strength of a dead man's faith in both of them. She opened it. That was all. She opened it and let what belonged come in.